Hey guys, it's Devest. So today I wanted to talk about the Korean War to clear up some misconceptions about it. So recently there has been a lot more discussion cropping up around the Korean War. It's not as straightforward as with World War II media. Western audiences don't really care about the Korean War. What there has been a lot of is Chinese slop. The People's Republic of China is unique in that they have to skirt past discussing the Second Sino-Japanese War. This is basically the same slop Russians make, just glorified mockbusters of major American films like Saving Private Ryan. Except while the Russians can use the national narrative they invented about the Second World War as the basis for war movies, the Chinese communists really can't. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, what is now the Taiwanese government, the Kuomintang, with the aid of the United States, provided all of the Chinese resistance against the Japanese, while the communists deliberately avoided fighting and collaborated with the Japanese to build up their strength for when they would eventually conquer the country. Now, while most of Europe and the Soviet Union collaborated with the Nazis, they have no problem creating a myth by focusing on the rare and exceptional resistance. The Chinese communists can't do that. To even discuss the war, they would have to acknowledge Taiwan as a separate entity. Hence why they don't talk about the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Chinese focus on a national myth about the Korean War instead. The Chinese narrative about the Korean War is then filtered down to thought-terminating cliches by lazy fake historians on YouTube, before finally being spit out for you to consume like a helpless baby bird being fed by its parents. So what actually happened during the Korean War? After the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union accelerated their invasion to conquer and loot as much of Japanese-occupied Asia as possible before an armistice was signed. When Japan did finally surrender, the United States accepted the Soviet occupation of Manchuria and the northern half of Korea, where Stalin installed puppet governments led by Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung, respectively. At the same time, the Soviet Union also increased the intensity of their guerrilla warfare campaign against the KMT. This had been ongoing throughout the Japanese invasion, but now that Japan was out of the picture, they accelerated. The United States, on the other hand, withdrew support from the KMT due to their poor morale and corruption, dooming them without direct military intervention by the United States. It's worth noting that China at this time was essentially a feudal peasant-based society for the vast majority of their population. So there was no real ideological conflict between the Chinese, just different warlords looking to garner power for themselves, and people who gravitated towards the strongest leader. It's like how in Warhammer 40K you'd be conscripted into the Imperial Guard, the Lost and the Damned, or the Tau Gavesa, if your planet was actively contested between the Imperium, Chaos, or the Tau. Except in our world, the Tau were the most rapey. At the same time this was going on, the United States occupied and installed a Western-aligned dictator in the southern half of the peninsula, Syngman Rhee. While the United States accepted a divided Korea, the Soviet Union pushed the narrative that the southern government was illegitimate and that Kim Il-sung was the rightful ruler of the entire peninsula. Basically, this communist state was arguing the legality of an absolute monarchy in Korea based on a mandate of heaven as a successor to the Joseon dynasty. Unlike North Korea, where the Soviet Union invested heavily in creating a Korean contingent to the Red Army, the United States left a few hundred military advisors to train a South Korean police force. Believing that the United States wouldn't bother defending South Korea, the Soviet Union invaded in late June of 1950, overwhelming the functionally non-existent South Korean military, crossing a line in the sand set by the United Nations against wars of aggression that had been established during the Nuremberg trials a few years earlier. In response, the United Nations drafted a mandate to repel the Soviet invasion, primarily led by the United States but with the military support of over 20 other nations. The American forces occupying Japan were mobilized to respond to the invasion. While the Soviet proxies occupied most of the country by the end of July, the Americans were digging in a perimeter around Busan in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. For the next 6 weeks, they held on against a larger force of Soviet proxies until an amphibious landing by the United Nations at Incheon in late September cut off the North Korean supply lines. By the start of October, the Korean People's Army ceased to exist. With this new development, the United Nations passed a subsequent resolution. intending to occupy North Korea to purge the aggressive government like Germany had been subjected to in 1945. This United Nations resolution was based on the faulty reasoning that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was a self-determined nation-state. In reality, it was a puppet state of the Soviet Union. That meant that it was an invasion of the Soviet Union itself. So Joseph Stalin responded by mobilizing his Chinese puppets to fight against the United Nations on the ground. The narrative goes that the Chinese People's Volunteer Army defeated the entire world all on their own, starting with their offensive in November, which is why North Korea still exists today. In my mind, that is analogous to Republicans boasting about how they protected Jeffrey Epstein and his rapist buddies. In reality, what happened was that the Soviet Union also became directly militarily involved in the Korean War in November, just through their Air Force. This was important because it signaled the Soviet Union was willing to go to war to retain control over North Korea, 14 months after they had detonated their first nuclear bomb, meaning the conflict could escalate into another world war in Europe and Asia, with the potential for a nuclear exchange between the United States and Soviet Union. So the conflict went from a United Nations victory to a nuclear-armed stalemate. The performance of the People's Volunteer Army was an embarrassment. The UN forces were in a perfect position to be annihilated in North Korea. They were spread out, isolated, in unfamiliar and inhospitable territory with infrastructure that had gotten worse since the Imjin War. And they were low on supplies after a rapid and exhausting advance through the Siberian winter high-pressure system. The PVA outnumbered the UN 5-1. Most importantly, the Chinese had the drop on them. American commanders didn't believe they could hold North Korea against a force of Korean guerrillas, much less the Chinese. But instead, they made a fighting retreat back to the 38th parallel. It would be like if at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, the Germans took 7 times as many casualties as the Romans and let all 3 legions escape intact. Then the German government cracked down on making fondue around the anniversary of the battle because Arminius's son died while eating fondue. After the retreat, the war turned into a stalemate that progressively de-escalated until it reached this simmering point that we have been stuck at for the past 70 years. I think that's all there is to say about the Korean War. Let me know if you want to argue in the comments below. Until next time, this has been Divest.